Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Antonio Wendell, and I'm the Associate Director for the Program on Education, Policy, and Governance here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Just really quickly, let me remind you that these proceedings are being recorded, and the previous sessions in the series are now posted and available to be viewed on our website. There are options for folks who are joining us to both interact with other viewers in the chat. And more importantly, we have also a Q&A panel, which we hope that you ask questions to our panelists. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you now to Professor Paul Peterson, who is the Director and Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you all for joining us for this, our final session of our conference, Should School Boards Run Schools? And our focus today is, well, if not school boards, then who? The case for alternatives to school governance. What do we know about the state or the city government or the mayor as alternative institutions that could manage our school system? So we shall have a distinguished group of panelists discuss this topic. And I am going to now turn the discussion over to our co-moderator, Michael Hartney. Michael Hartney is a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University, and he's also a now tenured member of the faculty of Boston College, a recent development, which I need to congratulate him on. Congratulations, Michael, and please introduce our panel.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm delighted to introduce our three participants. Leading off will be Beth Schueler. Beth is an assistant professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia. Prior to joining the faculty at UVA, she was a postdoc at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We're really lucky to have Beth. Her work has been published in top journals in the field, and she's one of the most exceptional young applied education researchers who is tackling governance issues. I think today she's going to talk to us about some of her research on state takeovers. Then we'll hear from Domingo Morel. Domingo is an associate professor of political science and public service at NYU. His research focuses on racial and ethnic politics, urban politics, and education politics and policy. And I recommend to you his book, his first book. He's now got a second one coming out, very productive. But his first book is very relevant for today. It's titled Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy. And that book won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. And finally, certainly not least, but coming last today will be Terry Grier. Terry has been inside the belly of many beasts. If the beasts here are large urban school districts, he's served as superintendent in many different environments, from San Diego to Guilford County, and later in his career for tenure as superintendent of the Houston School District in Texas. And during his superintendency there, based on the fact that HISD had a dropout rate decline of 3 percentage points and many other accolades, he was named by the Council of Great City Schools as the Urban Educator of the Year. So we're really lucky to have Terry to be able to comment from a practitioner's perspective today on the crucial topic of alternative models of governance. So with that, I will pause and turn over the virtual floor to Beth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael and Paul and everyone for being here. Really excited to join you all today on this important topic. So to give you a bit of context in terms of where I'm coming from, as Michael mentioned, I am a researcher who studies K-12 education policy, politics, and governance, and sort of the implications of those things for equity, oftentimes of student outcomes for the kids that are served by these systems. And a lot of my work has focused on efforts to improve low-performing school districts, in part because those systems tend to serve large concentrations of low-income students and students of color. And so improving them might have really important equity implications. And all of that work has really led me to think about the role of governance in either kind of impeding or potentially facilitating system improvement. As you know, education has a unique governance arrangement relative to other policy areas in the US, which tend to be governed by what political scientists call general purpose institutions, right? Even at the local level, like municipalities, city councils, mayors that handle a kind of a wide range of policy issues. Education policy is unique in that many of the decisions are made in a separate single purpose government made up of local school boards that, focus on this one particular policy area. And that's in large part by design. It was a system set up to, in many ways, try to insulate school boards from kind of party politics and national politics. But I think it's safe to say that most observers of that system kind of agree that the system has not been totally effective in eliminating politics, right? It's just sort of shifted the role that and the political dynamics of kind of education policymaking. I think there's no shortage of critiques of this system, many of which have been featured in earlier sessions of the conference. But, our topic for today is kind of around what alternatives exist to this system. And one option that has become increasingly common in recent years as kind of a response to low performance of school systems is state takeover of school districts. And what I mean by that is really a shift typically in decision-making power from a locally elected school board to the state. And that can result in a number of different things. It looks different in different places. So sometimes it means that the state appoints every member of a new board. So there's a fully state appointed board. Sometimes it's the majority of the board that's appointed. Sometimes it results in mayoral control or a state appointed kind of superintendent receiver. So it can look a little bit different from place to place, but it tends to be, what they kind of all have in common is this shift from moving away from a locally elected board to the state, at least temporarily. And in terms of, thinking about the implications for student outcomes, I think there's, if you're kind of thinking about like why this might be a good or a bad idea. So takeover might benefit student outcomes if, for example, we worry about kind of low voter turnout and lack of a representative electorate in school board elections. And so perhaps the state is kind of better able to look out for local interests. You might think this is a good idea if you're worried about sort of intransigent unions and interest groups kind of dominating school board elections and operations in such a way that makes it difficult to implement reforms that might benefit students. And so takeover kind of shifts the venue of decision-making to one where those groups might have less influence. Takeover also might be beneficial if states have greater capacity, kind of resources that they can kind of, centralize across the state, or expertise to improve school systems, more so than local entities. It also might be a good idea if you've got truly kind of bad actors operating local systems. So if there's kind of corruption or mismanagement among local officials. Now, on the other hand, there's a number of reasons to question whether this might be a good idea, right? So it could be that local leaders are actually in a better position to make decisions for their schools and systems. Maybe they're closer to the teachers and students that they're serving and can then tailor policy to local needs and conditions. Or if locally elected boards are simply better able to represent local interests, especially if there's kind of a mismatch between the populations that are in power at the state level versus the local level. And oftentimes, especially in cases of state takeover, those differences between state and local power vary along lines of race and class. And so perhaps, local representatives might be better at kind of serving their constituents. It could also be a bad idea if it really leads to significant disruptions, right? I'm thinking here of significant staff turnover that could kind of harm local capacity and sort of the long-term ability of local leaders to solve their own problems in the future. It could also be a bad idea if interest groups like unions actually play somewhat of a productive role in improvement efforts, and if takeover kind of reduces their influence. So I think there's a lot of theory and sort of questions on both sides of these issues about why we might think this could be a good or a bad idea. Well, what do we know kind of empirically about the impact of takeover specifically on student academic achievement? So Some of my earlier work and how I kind of got interested in this topic comes from a particular case of state takeover that may be familiar to many of you in the greater Boston area. And that's Massachusetts's takeover and turnaround of the Lawrence public school system. Lawrence is a mid-sized district in a kind of post-industrial city with a number of economic challenges. It's a little less than an hour north of Boston. The district serves a student population that's largely Hispanic, a community that's home to many families who have kind of newly arrived to Massachusetts from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. And the state had had its eye on the district for a number of years due to low performance that was kind of well below not only the state average, but also other kind of majority low income districts in the state. And so in the state had sort of at the time in 2010 had passed a new law, the Achievement Gap Act, that gave the state new sort of powers and authorities to intervene and to take over districts. And so Lawrence was the first district in which it kind of applied these new powers. And so the state took over the district and appointed a receiver who implemented a number of changes focused on things like pushing resources from the central office to the school level, increasing school level autonomy. There was a real emphasis on kind of extended learning time and also on making improvements to human capital. They were particularly aggressive when it came to replacing principals. They replaced about half of the principals in the early years. Less so with teachers. They did replace about 10% actively in the first year, but not as extreme on that dimension. They negotiated a new contract that was based teacher compensation more on merit than solely experience and education as our kind of traditional steps and lanes approach to teacher compensation. So some pretty dramatic changes. And I worked in collaboration with Joshua Goodman and David Deming, and we examined the impact of those reforms and found that the changes really led to some meaningful positive benefits for kids in terms of especially their math achievement in the early years of those reforms. A big part of the gains were explained by these small group extended learning time programs. It's an intervention. In Lawrence, they were called acceleration academies. Sometimes they're called vacation academies. These have now been implemented in a number of low performing districts in Massachusetts and beyond. And so that was kind of the story in terms of student outcomes. Another aspect of the Lawrence kind of story that I think is worth noting is that all these changes seem to occur without, at least in the early years, without really generating significant public resistance, which I think is kind of rare for a takeover case and district-wide turnaround. And I think that was, so some of the work I've done, I think highlights that there were some important features of the local context that kind of helped make this easier for leaders. But there were also a number of things leaders did, including then receiver Jeff Riley, who's now the Massachusetts State Commissioner of Education, his deployment of what he described as kind of a third way approach to trying to kind of reconcile seemingly polarized debates. So they renegotiated the teacher contract, but they also did a lot in collaboration with the local teachers union along the way, even giving them control, kind of management of a school in the district. And at one point, Randy Weingarten even pointed to Lawrence as kind of a model for union district collaboration. They engaged charter managers to operate a very small number of schools in the district, but they didn't convert the schools to charter status. So they kind of retained neighborhood-based assignment and a unionized teaching force. So kind of addressing the major concerns that opponents of the charters had in Massachusetts. So this is kind of not your sort of stereotypical case of takeover and turnaround, but one that I think provided an interesting and sort of positive proof point for what takeover could potentially accomplish for low performing district that serves a number of students that are disadvantaged on some dimensions. And so after I had been involved in that work, I really wanted to know, was Lawrence an outlier, right? Like, is this what's true more broadly nationwide? And so I sought to answer that question with a collaborator, Josh Bleiberg. We tracked all the takeovers that have occurred since the late 80s when the first ones occurred. And for a subset of the takeovers, we could look at the impact on student achievement outcomes. And what we found was that on average, takeovers did not actually seem to benefit student achievement outcomes. And in fact, we found suggestive evidence that takeover could actually be disruptive to achievement in reading in particular, especially in the early years of reform. And so, this evidence kind of looking across states nationwide really didn't seem to bode well for takeover as a particularly promising alternative to school board governance. Now, I'll say that, we do find interesting variation in the impacts of takeover kind of depending on features of the context where it's implemented. It's been least effective in districts serving, for example, higher concentrations of Black students. And I think that's particularly important because we also find that the racial composition of a district predicts whether that district will be taken over. So districts serving greater shares of Black students are more likely to be taken over even after you control for differences in academic performance. So I think overall, no kind of, certainly takeover does not seem to be kind of a silver bullet based on our research. That doesn't mean that takeover can never be helpful for student outcomes, right? We do find variation, both positive and negative kind of proof points. Lawrence is a case where this seemed to be helpful, but on average, not a silver bullet. And so these findings kind of have me thinking about Winston Churchill's famous quote, right? Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, right? And so I'll sort of end with a bit of a provocative, hopefully, question for us to think about together, which is like, perhaps despite all their flaws, maybe school boards are our least worst form of education governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Domingo, your thoughts?
Thank you, Michael. And it's always nice to be in conversation with Beth. I, always, whenever in conversations about takeovers, I always point to Beth's important research on this. So I'm going to respond, add, really not really respond, but add a little bit to Beth's comments. But before I do, I wanted to point to, since this is the last of the conversations on this forum, this important forum on the importance of school boards, or maybe not, I wanted to share some thoughts on the premise of this conversation, which I don't think has been sufficiently addressed by other panelists throughout this conversation. And so, I really want to complicate what we think school boards are about, right? And so throughout these conversations, school boards, at least in my view, have been discussed in a way in which, their primary focus are about improving student outcomes, or, achieving, producing high achieving schools, right? And so I just want to say that is one of many things that school boards do, right? So yes, of course, their task should be to put in place the mechanisms, governance to produce high achieving education outcomes, right? But, that is an ahistorical, a very limited view of what school boards do. So that if you pay attention to school boards in communities of color who have been fighting for the right to have teachers of color, to have increased funding for schools, to have curricula that reflects the realities of these communities, right? The school boards are the places where this happens, where the public space to debate what and to fight for and to protest these conditions. And so that we can't think of school boards as separate from our political, economic, social realities. They are a function of these realities. And so what these communities have done historically is rely on education, and particularly the school boards, as an instrument to fight against these inequities that exist in these communities. So I just wanted to point that out and to add that as an important part of the conversation of what school boards do. The second part is that also, like, this common theme throughout the conversation, throughout these series, the series is about, what adults do and how they essentially are involved in ways in education that are harmful to kids. And, while certainly, there are adult politics, if you want to call it that, or adult involvement, which may be counterproductive to what we want for kids, we also can't forget that the adults are the ones, and particularly in these communities, that have been fighting for these kids, right? So when, when the law of the land was segregated schools, who was fighting for the right conditions for education for students? It were the adults in the communities and the elected officials. Who was fighting for these kids? It were the Black teachers, right? And Latino teachers in these communities, right? And so when I just want to complicate this idea of the adults being kind of the problem in education, where in many ways they have been fighting to be the solution for education problems across the country. So with that being said, I just want to add on to the topic at hand here, particularly following Beth's comments. My research on state takeovers, I show that, takeovers are about politics and political power, and that they have the effect of disempowering communities that have political power at the time of the takeover. And that in some cases, they provide opportunities for communities who have been disempowered, who have been marginalized, to have the space to be able to then be part of the conversation, right? And so I think Lawrence is an example of this type of experience. Central Falls in Rhode Island, which I studied, is part of this experience, right? Where at the time of the takeover, so I'll take Central Falls, for instance, at the time of the takeover, it was very close to being a majority Latino community. The schools themselves were majority Latino, and they had no Latino school board members, right? And it was an elected board, and it was an all-white school board. When the state of Rhode Island took over the school district in the early 1990s, they removed the locally elected school board, appointed a new school board, and that new school board had Latino representation for the first time in the city's history. And from there, we see what, political scientists have shown over time, is that the path to political empowerment for communities often begins at the school board level, from there to the city council level, and then mayoral level. And Central Falls looks like a lot of other places where you had then Latino representation on the school board, then the city council, and then mayoral level. And that was all ignited by the state takeover of the school district in the early 1990s. So like Beth, I think that there is an opportunity there for takeovers to be seen, a lot more perhaps opening up democratic opportunities rather than closing. But we also have 30 years of evidence to show that places like Lawrence and places like Central Falls are essentially outliers, and that most of these takeovers are actually disempowering to Black communities, and that they, instead of creating opportunities, as Beth has mentioned, where the state can actually be a convener, can provide resources, can provide expertise, rather than doing that, in these communities, what they have been doing is separating communities from their schools, creating hostile climate for communities to actually improve education the way that we all would want it to see it happen, right? And so I would just caution, on one hand, there are these possibilities where the state could come in and intervene and be supportive, but in most cases, that's not what we see happen. And so that just leads to, further questions, and in my view, just really how state takeovers are highly problematic for communities of color. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Domingo. Terry.
Thank you. It's good to be with all of you. I was a school superintendent for 32 years across America in too many places. A lot of folks said the guy can never keep a job. But, I've tried so hard over the years to work with people to help kids, and always hoped that I could have done more. I've worked for small school boards. I've worked with medium-sized and large school boards. And I can tell you governance matters. When I was a school superintendent in Houston, for example, in 2012, the State Commissioner of Education decided to force annex one of our adjoining school districts that had been labeled as a failing district into the Houston ISD school district because of our reputation for being able to turn around and improve low-performing schools. So they moved the North Forest School District 7,500 kids into our school system. We reconstituted every school. Everybody had to apply for their jobs again. We only hired, I think, 2 of the employees out of that district. 3 years later, there were no failing schools. We had no complaints from any parent in that school district. And we saw a lot of kids graduate, go to Tier 1 universities. We thought it was a pretty good success story. Fast forward to this year, that same Department of Education now is taking over the Houston Independent School District. I retired in 2016, moved on. They've gone through 3 or 4 superintendents since then. The board has turned over, and it is it's a sad day in the district. I got to tell you, there's school boards across America that are doing phenomenally good work. There's school boards that are doing okay, and then there's boards that are dysfunctional. And someone mentioned earlier about special interest groups. You have the teachers union on one hand. In some districts where I work, thought nothing of spending $500,000 to get 2 school board members elected to be able to represent them and their views. And then you can look at other districts where I've worked, where you had politics on the right elect board members because they were upset about certain books that were in the libraries. And it was just back and forth, back and forth. I know when I was in Houston, our board did address social issues. For example, we there and in Guilford County, we retired Native American mascots. In Houston, we renamed all the schools that had been named over after Confederate War heroes. We did some great things from a justice perspective, but I also saw school boards where I worked that never talked about children, never talked about student academic performance. And I've often said, I even made this proposition to a board. I said, look, why don't we come up with 4 key indicators of success, a few at the elementary, middle, and high school level. And they don't have to all be academic. It could be teacher retention. It could be turnover. It could be dropout. Let's focus on those. And at the end of 4 years, if we don't make significant, which is at least 1 standard deviation of improvement, I'll retire, you resign, and agree not to run for the school board again. Let's all get into this game together. Let's all have some goals, and let's decide that we're here to make things better for kids. We're not here, I'm sorry, you want to run for the city council, you want to run for the mayor. I understand the importance of that in some communities. I'm an educator. I focus on teaching kids how to read. And I want kids to not drop out of high school because I know what happens with kids of color, particularly males who drop out of high school and the percentage of them that are incarcerated. Our job and school boards' jobs have to be to focus on how to improve education in this country. And I got news for everybody. If you think it's working, you're wrong. And how we go about trying to find a governance structure that will help us change that, I think is the $50 question that we're talking about today. It's interesting. It really is a challenge, and I've thought about it many times over my career. I don't know that I have the answer. I know friends who worked in school districts where the mayor does control the school board, or the superintendent reports directly to the mayor. But then all of a sudden, every decision that you make, if it's a critical decision, it depends on whether the mayor is running for re-election or not. And so it's the politics, how to get politics out of a system that people continue to say is part of the democratic process, I think is a challenge. A lot of school board races, you only have 15% voter turnout. It's not really a democratic representation of the community. It's not. And it's tremendously challenging. I've known a lot of good superintendents in my career. And it's not just school boards, by the way. Let me point that out. Part of the problem sometimes are the people the school boards hire to run school districts, and they fall into that same political trap. And versus trying to improve schools, they're trying to keep their jobs. They're trying to survive. And so it's a very perplexing situation. I know in Houston, where I worked, we looked at other types of site-based decision-making where schools could have control over their own budget and do their own hiring and have an advisory group. That was another possibility that I think merits a lot of discussion.
Well, Terry, thank you very much for that. And thank you all for your opening observations. I have some really good questions here. And I had some questions of my own, but I think the first question that's appeared on the screen is one that I'd love to hear what you all have to say. And that we'll start with Beth, but go around the horn. Baltimore City schools have been failing for more than 50 years. No amount of money helps. The only good superintendent gave up after 6 years of his 10-year contract. Takeover seems to be the only possibility for making a difference. Your thoughts?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I think part of this, the challenge is that the research, we really need to know a lot more about. So we know there's a lot of variation in the effectiveness of takeover across places, which I think requires leaders to be really thoughtful about where they enact this change and, you know, try to you know, avoid doing it in places where it's going to do harm, right? And think about it and consider it in places where it might have a benefit. And so I think we need a lot more research on to try to understand like why this works, where this works, to try to match interventions to contexts. And so I think, you know, probably someone who knows more about the Baltimore context than I do would be better suited to answering this question. I think, you know, some questions I would ask would be around really identifying the source of the problem and the challenge, and whether kind of school board you know, dysfunction or, you know, is a big piece of the story and kind of the reason for the challenge.
Domingo.
So Baltimore has already been taken over by the state, right? So the state of Maryland took over the Baltimore schools, and you know, I don't think anyone can say that, you know, there's exciting results there, right? And so with the question, the person who asked the question, I agree that it has its challenges, but I would argue that takeover is not the solution because they already went down that road. And so I think to Beth's point about what are the other conditions there that we may try to examine, I mean, I think it's pretty clear in Baltimore, the persistent poverty of that city, the persistent disinvestment in these communities, particularly Black communities in Baltimore, right? Housing issues, food insecurity, all of these kinds of things that affect not just education, affect the lives of these communities. Those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. So takeover hasn't been the solution, and I don't think it will be the solution, but I think there are other things that we need to consider as we explore what are the best things to help support the Baltimore public schools.
I agree with Domingo. I think that unless there's a reason that the board will not let the staff implement strategies that are proven to improve failing schools, such as having a great principal in each school, having an effective teacher in each classroom, giving kids the additional time, maybe an extra hour to the school day, and 3-on-1 tutoring, and having a curriculum that's very focused. Unless the board's not willing to put the additional revenue. People talk equity all the time, but when you go into these schools, there's no question. The bottom third of your lowest performing schools, they need more money. They need more time. They need more support. Your best teachers need to be incented to work in those schools. Houston, we paid teachers $10,000 more to work in our lowest performing schools. And then we added an hour to the school day, which added to their salaries. And that's one of the reasons that in 3 years, we eliminated the math gap. We eliminated the math achievement gap in the lowest 1/3 of our lowest performing schools in the Houston Independent School District. Took a lot of good people. It was a lot of hard work, but just state coming in and taking it over, I'm not sure is the answer either.
Okay, we have a question that's been posed in the chat to Domingo in particular, and I'm going to read that question, but then I'd like to kind of broaden the question out so that all of the panelists can comment. So the question posed is, how do you think about cases where we have clear trade-offs between what's good for student outcomes and what may be optimal for adult politics in a community? And how should those trade-offs be made? And the way I'd like to broaden that question a little bit is, you know, taking into mind some of Domingo's research showing the politics surrounding takeover decisions and how there are oftentimes disparities in the communities that are picked on for takeovers. Do the panelists see any potential path toward creating more neutral or objective criteria, maybe in state law or in regulatory guidelines that would put a district on the chopping block for governance reforms if some set of plausibly neutral criteria were reached, so it doesn't look like a particular state leader's just picking on a district here or there?
Well, so I mean, to the first part of the question, to the trade-offs. I mean, I think, I would like to hear what are some specific examples of trade-offs between student outcomes and quote unquote community or adult-centered politics, right? I think that genuine community-centered politics are politics that are about the kids, right? So there may be people who have a different agenda that they might say that they're community-centered, but then, I think that the community itself would question that. And so I don't really see a trade-off in that. And so what I think I'm trying to get to here is these genuine community-centered approaches to solving school problems. They're not a trade-off in my view, or somehow in conflict with what's best for the kids. So I'm seeing Vladimir, who's asking the question here. I'm sorry to take time from the others. I just want to be specific. Employment concerns of adults, which play a big role in my book, versus kids' academic needs and outcomes. So, and this was the question that Vladimir was asking. So, I think the question about adequately funding teachers, providing benefits for teachers where they can actually do the meaningful work of education, I don't think that is in conflict with what's best for kids. So right now, like in places like Chicago, in places like Arizona, where teachers were fighting for better conditions, better pay, better work, livable conditions, I don't know how that is in tension with what's best for the kids. So I will just have to disagree with that,
All right, so for other panelists.
Well, I tell you, this whole issue of what's in conflict with what's best for kids, there's no question in my mind that teachers are underpaid. There's too many unfunded state mandates. When states take over a district, one of the very first things I think they should do is remove all of that. Give teachers an opportunity to go in the classroom and teach. Teachers should not have one-size-fits-all training. All the teachers should not have to go through training. All the teachers don't need training. Some of you teachers are the ones who could be doing the training. So I think that when you look at state takeover as an answer, certainly I've seen districts that are so bad that you think, my God, we've got to do something. I can promise you, Houston, you can just go back this most recent takeover, and I've stayed out of it because I'm a former superintendent there. But you can look at it, and even when the Commissioner of Education was threatening to take over the school district unless the board behaved itself in a more professional manner and focused more on students and student results, it did little to help. So this idea of let's set up triggers that if boards don't behave in a certain way, or if the district's not accomplishing certain things, that you will be taken over, those threats don't seem to be an effective deterrent.
And I'll just add that I think on this kind of question of trade-offs, I think it would be a much more complicated question if we found, for example, that on average takeovers, harmed adults in communities, but benefited students, right? I think that would make the question of whether to rely on takeovers a really tricky one. But I think that's not where the evidence seems to be pointing. And I think we know, like from some of the work that Vlad and others have been involved in, that kind of descriptive representation, so the extent to which school boards represent local communities, that actually seems to generate benefits in terms of spending and student outcomes for kids in those communities. And so, I think Domingo's work suggests that takeovers decrease descriptive representation in some communities, increase it in others in ways that are kind of consistent. It's the same communities in which takeover harms descriptive representation that it harms student outcomes. And it's on the flip, this more similar communities in which it improves descriptive representation that it improves student outcomes. So I think there's a pattern of results that's consistent between the literatures on how this affects student outcomes and how it affects adults in these systems that sort of suggests a mechanism through which descriptive representation seems to really matter for student outcomes.
I think one thing, we're spending a lot of time, and I understand that's part of the dialogue and conversation around takeover. And one of the big questions that, if not takeover, what? Because schools can't be allowed to continue to fail. Schools in this country have not taught children how to read. And most of our Black and brown children in this country aren't reading in grade level, third grade. And it has a great impact on achievement. And so I'm with you. I'm not sure that state takeover in and of itself is the answer. So if not, then the question was started out around governance. So if that form of governance is not the answer, I think we need to spend some time and we need to do some research on what is the answer, because what we're doing right now is not working. Takeover may not work, may work in some situations, it may not work in other. I can promise you the kind of governance that we have right now in most places is not being very effective in terms of producing the kind of student outputs that our children deserve and that our country needs.
So that's a very good question. And so let me just throw that back to the panelists, because the options out there might be, we should have the mayor or the city government as a whole be responsible for our schools. Why do we have to have all these special districts out there? And schools are just one of many special districts. Why don't we have a more unified system of government? That's one option. Another option that's out there is that, forget about takeovers, that if the state actually ran the schools and then empowered individual schools to have to operate on their own, they would have their own professional leadership that would be appointed by the state. The Germans do this in every single state in Germany with great success. We ignore this all the time. We pay no attention to the fact that other countries, Australia does the same thing. Other countries, they don't have this so-called democratic institution, which doesn't look very democratic when you look at it up close. And yet they have better functioning educational systems than we do. So there are some options out there. So I'm going to ask the members of the panel, okay, what is your option?
Well, I would say, with all due respect to Germany, to Australia, and to some other countries that you mentioned, they don't have the realities that we have in this country and the racial realities and history that we have in this country, right? And so, the realities of Newark, Baltimore, Oakland, Detroit, right? Those realities are very different than the realities that we might see in other places. And so, given that these are the racial, political, economic, social realities of this country, what are the best arrangements? I would say that state governing is not the optimal arrangement, primarily because in our states we have these are Republican-led states with Republican-led state legislatures, then governing over communities of color who have different political interests and different political ideologies, right? And so that creates the type of politics that lead to hostile type of relationship between state officials and local officials, right? And so mayoral control also, I think, has its challenges. I mean, I go back to what Beth said, about Winston Churchill and democracy. I think that the solution is deepening democracy rather than trying to get away from democracy. And I think the work Vladimir has done and other panelists, which you've had throughout this conversation, have shown ways that we can deepen democracy where communities are more engaged. Terry's right. In some of these places, 15% turnout election, these kind of things we can do way, way better, right? And so I would urge us to think about ways to deepen democracy rather than to get away from it.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree and just kind of echo the need to focus more on how do we improve the functioning of school boards? How do we think about sort of election timing to improve turnout and kind of efforts to professionalize locally elected school boards themselves?
Okay, so everybody's going to defend those school boards to the very death.
No,
Terry? Oh, okay, Terry, it's up to you.
Not everyone. I get this whole issue around democracy, and I believe that public education is the key to a strong democracy. I really do believe that. I do still think there has to be, we have to find a different way. And maybe it's a hybrid. I don't have the answer, and I'm not sure anyone else does. I'll keep coming back to what I've been saying. What we've been doing is not working. What we're doing in our urban settings is not working. We need to find a way, and people have to get serious about this if we expect schools to change. We can't keep doing the same thing that we've been doing and expect to have different results. I still come back to, gosh, I wish somebody would just stand up and say, let's try something different here, and let's see what this looks like. I love the idea, and I have for years. I've made that as an offer, by the way, once to a school board. I said to a board, I tell you what, I'll take a 20% salary reduction if you'll agree to set goals, hold me accountable for them. If I mistreat people and we don't reach the goals, I'll agree to put in my contract that you fire me. But we're going to only meet 4 times a year. I can tell you, I've gone to school board meetings and I knew what kind of meeting we would have by the way my board members dressed before they came in, because as soon as they came in, they looked for the TV cameras. I want my constituents to know. And it was just an absolutely, and you can call with gee whiz, this is democracy. Well, 2 months later, the board members files to run for city council. And maybe that's okay. I wanted the board member to help us focus on what we need to do different to help children learn how to read. And it's horribly frustrating. Good school superintendents, good leaders, you cannot do any more than your school board will allow you to do in terms of implementing the changes that have to occur. Schools don't get better unless you change adult behavior.
And, I want to agree with Terry here, right? So if a school board member is more interested in, let's just say, just running for other office or just, showing up for the cameras, then, the solution to that, in my view, is to have, again, a deeper involvement that is beyond just that school board meeting, right? That the community, through its different avenues, mechanisms, which is parental, students, other community organizations, that they are part of the fabric of the school board rather than this very limited conception of, school boards, which is the election, which very few people participate in, the school board meeting, where sometimes you get high participation, sometimes you get very little participation, the, signing off on a particular document. That's a very limited conception of what school boards can do, school boards do. I think that we should be thinking about what are the ways that we can deepen democracy in schools so that Terry as a superintendent and other school board members and, community partners are fully engaged in what it is necessary to improve the schools. So I'm thinking about like Jonathan Collins' work, who you had here previously, right? Jonathan Collins has been thinking about ways to improve the quality of democratic participation in these spaces, right? So incorporating these types of mechanisms rather than this very limited, I would say kind of a paternalistic view of what governance is and what school boards should be doing.
I want to press a little bit on this issue of what are we thinking about when we define democracy, and kind of ask more about not just the participatory side of it, but also the ability for average folks to hold their governments accountable. And so, I've come back to this example a little other times during the conference, and that's Washington, D.C. So I'm particularly curious what Domingo would have to say about this, but also the other panelists. And that is that, D.C. is a case where you took a system basically with traditional school board governance where, to hold the school board accountable, the voters have to kind of be active for several election cycles. You have staggered elections, turnout is really low. And you can say, yeah, there are these avenues to participation. But on the other hand, even the opponents of Michelle Rhee and Adrian Fenty in DC were able to, in a single election, have her removed as superintendent. And so I'm just sort of curious here, despite the fact that mayoral control is oftentimes a governance arrangement that's denounced as being anti-democratic, couldn't one make the case that when you centralize accountability in a single actor like a mayor, and it's really clear who their superintendent is, that you're not really taking the public's voice off of the table. You're just streamlining it.
Well, so what I would say to that, the concern in terms of democratic representation, democratic accountability, democratic engagement, right? That, you know, I've been trying to express through my work and through this conversation, it becomes problematic with mayoral control in the sense that there are parts of the city that the mayor may be more accountable to than others, right? And there are interests that the mayor may be more accountable than others. And so, you know, from urban politics, we're very familiar with the role of, you know, the real estate developers, you know, and the business interest within a community. If they have an interest in promoting a type of education agenda, right? So it's equally political, but they have their own agenda, and the mayor is very much tied to that interest for their political success, then that pushes the agenda, the education agenda, in a particular direction, away from what I think is, you know, important for us to think about, these community interests, right? And so that's where I think that the mayoral control issue can become problematic. That's not to say that that mayor may not be held accountable, democratically accountable to the citizens of that city. I'm just saying that there are interests that come into play and may have a bigger role within education politics when it's mayoral control rather than electoral school boards. At the same time that I say that, very few electoral designs across this country, school board elections, we can say are democratic, right? They suffer in many, many ways, and I don't need to get into this. Your whole conversation throughout this series has focused on that, and I agree entirely with that, right? I'm just pointing out to how mayoral control may be also problematic.
Okay, so I do want to follow up on that, because I just want to highlight the fact that the District of Columbia's school system has improved at a more dramatic rate than any state in the country since the District of Columbia underwent a major school reform with Michelle Rhee being appointed by a mayor. So they had an elected school board, they shifted it to mayoral control. The new mayor came in, he appoints Michelle Rhee. She changes the whole structure of the teaching profession in the District of Columbia, and the test scores in the district have steadily improved over the next 20 years. This is an amazing story of how much can be gained from having an effective administrative structure. And it's true that Michelle Rhee and the mayor, she left and the mayor left, but the system stayed in place. The new mayor that came in that took the place of the reform mayor never dismantled all the reforms that had been introduced in the District of Columbia. So, and we see that, you know, you could look at New York City as not quite so dramatic an example, but a similar example of a strong mayor being able to really having a profound effect. It's very hard to find the same capacity from school boards. So I'm going to throw that question to Terry and see how he responds to it, and then we'll pass it around.
Well, as I said, there's school boards in this country that are extremely effective. They're the ones that focus on children. They want results. They hold their superintendent accountable. When you go to their board meetings, you see student-centric things on their agenda. Then you go to other places where the school board is quite frankly, could care less about kids. And you say that's just not true. Yes, it is. That's the harsh reality. I know when I left Houston, we were spending about $2,800 more per child in the third of our lowest performing schools. Next month after I retired, the school board decided to take that money and divide it and spend it equally across the school district. All those reforms went right out of the window that had led to our being able to absolutely close the math achievement gap and do some other good things. So I do think that there is something to be said for consistency of purpose when you are trying to focus on reform initiatives. You can't expect to change things overnight. And when you can have consistent initiatives that are research-based, that are proven to have worked, they'll work in your place too. But you just can't have new people coming in and playing politics and trying to tell you who the cafeteria manager should be in this school and who a bus driver should be over there in that school. Board members who come in trying to influence where money is spent, which vendors you hire, who the new principal is going to be of this school. All of a sudden, all of that becomes self-serving, and it has little to do with student outcomes. So I understand what you're saying. I can also point to other places where you've had mayoral control that haven't been effective like DC has. And I know Michelle Rhee, I know every superintendent they've had before her and after her, and they've had some awfully good leaders there. But I can show you other places where you've had strong mayoral control and things have not gone as well. I was a big fan of Joe Klein's in New York City, but Joe left and some new mayor, some other things didn't go quite as well.
So Beth, you've done research on state takeovers. What does the research say about mayoral leadership?
Yeah, I think we know much less about. It's a little bit tricky because there are fewer cases and across states, and so I think there's less sort of systematic, rigorous evidence, and we're sort of relying on a handful of case studies where a lot varies, right? The contexts vary, the policies leaders pursued vary, and so it's tricky to say. One thing I'll just add on the DC point is that I think it's not totally clear the sort of extent to which there was democratic accountability that went above and beyond what you would expect with a traditional school board. I mean, the figureheads were voted out, but as you've mentioned, the policies largely were sustained over time. It wasn't as though they were voted out and there was a major change in direction for the policy. So I think it's a little bit more of a complicated story there in terms of the sustainabilities of the reforms and how governance kind of intersects with that.
All right, so we're running up against the time deadline. So I'm going to give you all 1 minute to say your final observations as to what should be done. What should be done, not what's wrong, but what should be done. So we're going to start with you, Domingo.
So I don't think anyone here on this panel or many people across this country are satisfied with the state of education and the state of democracy as it relates to school board. I think we're all in agreement. What I want to suggest is that we think about ways in which how we can deepen democracy rather than run away from it, rather than come up with solutions to education that involve us getting further away from democracy. So I think throughout this, I would encourage people who have not seen the other speakers, the other panelists, go to those videos and see what kind of conversations people had about how are the ways that we can deepen democracy. I think that's the way to do this. And finally, I don't think that there's any solution to education, particularly for communities of color, that don't involve the involvement of communities of color, the parents, the students, the leaders of community organizations in these communities, right? And so that's where I would point. That's what I think that we need to be doing, and I don't think that we've really done that historically. So
thank you, Domingo. Terry.
So I would like someone somewhere to establish a set of accountability criteria for board members. I would want it to be tied to community and student outputs. I want the board members to be held accountable somewhere besides at the election box. And I would like to see a trial where people say that if we haven't improved by 1 standard deviation or more over an 8 or a 6 year period, board members can no longer serve, superintendents can no longer serve. We want to improve our educational system, and we want people on our board that's going to focus on that and make that a priority.
And finally, Beth.
Yeah, so I think it sounds like there's some agreement around a number of potential reforms to improve and make sort of boards more democratic. So I think some of the pieces there would be thinking about kind of the timing of school board elections, so making them more aligned with national and statewide races to kind of improve turnout, so we get beyond these sort of single digit turnout, low kind of involvement and information races. Provide greater information on kind of performance and on candidates in school board races, try to provide resources and training and capacity building to improve representation for communities on school boards, and kind of professionalize these organizations, so resources and kind of supports for board members to use performance information and data for decision making, for example. And then finally, kind of structures, I think, for greater community participation and sort of ways to facilitate in the board meeting process and decision making process greater involvement of community members in school board decision making.
So thank you all on the panel. Thank you, listeners, for being with us for this conference. I think the theme that came up today is really fundamental. Can you have effective government? Can you have effective democratic government? Do the forces of democracy lead to ineffectiveness, inefficiency? Is that an inevitable problem of democracy? Everybody says, okay, yes, we're going to accept ineffective government because it's a democratic form, or is there a way to move beyond that? And so I think the conversation today just highlighted the fundamental question that we posed at the beginning. I wish we had an answer. I wish we could say school boards should run schools. I think I heard some people say that, but then I think I've also heard some voices out there, and I see them in the comments in the chat, that, well, if the school boards are going to run the schools, you're going to have plenty of problems. So there we have it. Thank you very much. I think it's been a great series of conversations. I've learned a lot from it. I hope you all have as well. So thank you, Michael, for co-moderating this event with us all. Thank you, Antonio, for all your organizational things. And thank you, panelists, for your contributions today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.